All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Thanks very much for joining the Power BI days. I know it's getting towards the end of the schedule, so I appreciate those of you who have either woken up to join or have stuck around to join. My name is Gina Meronek, and today I want to talk about using Power BI for the systems administrator. So who am I? I am a BI technical consultant that works for Robert Half Technology. It's an international consulting group, and got some experience over time with various parts of the Microsoft stack over about 20 years. And my main factoid for this presentation is that I have loved working with Power BI since it was called Power View, and it was an add-in into Excel. So for today's agenda, we will have a poll to start off just to get a feel with where folks' experience is with Power BI, and just add on some terms that might be necessary for us to know. And it looks like that poll has just been opened, so go right ahead and answer. And then we're going to touch a bit on why model administrative data. So there's been a lot of great presenters already today, and there's going to be some more. And I've also got resources at the end of this slide for how to create stuff in Power BI. My goal today is to get people thinking why they might want to model data that isn't financial reports or sales data or sensor data, but rather the kind of data you interact with when you're trying to figure out, how are my systems doing? Going to be pretty demo heavy, and I will try to get through at least 2 of them, but I'm planning on uploading the various demos that I've created into the materials that'll be available with this presentation. We're going to hold questions to the end, and like I said, I've got a number of resource links at the end for other places to get training on Power BI. There's just lots of availability. So I believe that poll is still open.
I just closed it.
Super.
About 60% of the people use Power BI all the time.
Oh my, okay.
30% of them in here in the webinar tinker with it a bit.
Sure.
And only 40% go have some analysts that use it.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so we're dealing with a pretty experienced crowd, which is great. Then I will focus a little bit more on some of the different data scenarios, and we don't have to worry too much about the how-to. So very good, good context. Okay, so we've done that. What I want to drive home for today's focus is not Power BI within the ecosystem. This great diagram comes from Dustin Ryan, and you can see it on his website, SQL Dusty, but rather we're going to be just working with Power BI Desktop today, because I'm trying to pitch this as, hey, this is something for free that you as an administrator can get into without having to worry about getting executive buy-in for the whole ecosystem. Hopefully it helps you make that case, but we're just going to be talking about what you can do with Power BI Desktop today. So why would you want to model IT level data? DBAs would say, hey, I am really good with working with DMVs, but those are great for what's happening right now. And they're also only great if you know how to interpret those results. Next, you probably have a whole grab bag of your favorite reference queries for figuring out what's going on. And there's lots of great free tools out there too that can help you navigate query plans, etc. But those usually come back either in painful detail or in summarizing that maybe you didn't get to control. And it's also hard to ask 2 questions at once. You end up having to have multiple queries. And that means you have to know what you're looking for. And sometimes when something's broken, you just don't know what you're looking for. You only know that it's broken. There's also built-in reports for Management Studio, and those can be great resources, assuming that that's the only way you want to ask that question, that the default granularity for Query Store or the filters that are available work for you, or with the SSRS report, same thing. And there are some spectacular third-party tools out there for helping us figure out what's going on in our systems. But you may or may not have the budget to put those spectacular tools on all of your systems. So can those help you? Sure. I want to help people interact with their IT data in a way that doesn't have to gate its way through a budget committee. Okay, so let's make sure I'm sure most of this audience is somewhat clear on why data modeling, but it's an important thing to remember that Power BI is not just a data visualization tool. It's actually, the real power is having that tabular model so that it's easy for you to keep changing your mind about, I wonder if I look at it at the weekly level, what does that mean, versus looking at it on, well, is behavior different Monday versus Wednesday, or between 4 and 6 p.m., that kind of thing. It also is important for you to take a look at now versus on average, and I have the asterisk on average because you've got to be careful about, great, I've got all these details, I've aggregated them, and I'm looking at the average behavior. You got to also know, wow, I probably should do a median average or a median measure too, because maybe that average is influenced by an outlier, and that outlier is making everything seem different than it actually is. Also looking for the holes in the data. So if you're looking for heartbeat type information, that tells you a lot about what's going on, but you also need to know, when did we not get any data from that server? I wonder why. So having that data loaded, the details loaded into a data model, means that you can keep looking at it from different aspects without having to keep pestering the server saying, I'm sorry, I need you to group it a different way now. I know you're handling other workload, but I need you to do just this one more thing for me. And data visualizations. So I did a controversial thing by including a pie chart on this slide, but data visualizations built on top of those models are wonderful for helping you explore the data, working with that built-in cross-filtering, so you can start understanding the relationships between what you're looking at. It also gives you the data in a format that's much easier to share. So for example, if you want to model like the data that comes out of the Ola Hollengren scripts for maintaining your SQL servers, you can set those up to write to a table, and I think that's part of the default settings. So if you as a professional services company, or you as a responsible DBA want to be able to respond, yes, absolutely, we are running these indexing jobs, or we are running these backup jobs, and you can see what we're backing up, how long it's taking, and whether or not, okay, you may be worried about the call center system getting slow and thinking, oh, I bet they're running backups. Well, you can give a chart to a stakeholder much more readily than just saying, no, that's not when we run the backup jobs. It just gives you more tools to communicate with people that may not love the admin details the way that you do. All right, so enough with the slides. Let's pop over to my VM. So I will get through as many of the workbooks as I can, but like I said, I will be uploading these to the reference materials as well, because all of this is modeled off of data on my little test VM here. I'll get Management Studio starting in the background too. I missed that one. So let's talk a little bit about the data that I've got in here. A classic thing for you to need to know on a SQL Server is, okay, what's running on it on a scheduled basis? How long is that taking? Because if you inherit a server, you'll get some anecdotal information on what it does, but it's much more compelling to say, okay, let's get me a catalog of what's running and when is it running and how long is it taking. And I have a third data set here that's working off an export from the Extended Events system health session. And I don't mean for that to be the one and only performance metric, but rather, let's say, a gateway into making it easier for people to start becoming comfortable with data like extended events data that is in XML, which traditionally is a little hard to navigate unless you really, really like running or creating queries against XML, or if you really like loading other data into tables. So let's talk a little bit. Let's see if that Management Studio got fired up yet. Nope, still thinking. 18.1, I don't know if the rest of you have had this experience, but I'm finding 18.1, it takes a little while. So we'll look at it through the source instead. So I have a traditional connect to SQL Server and pull in some data type source. And all I've done is taken my little reference query, which is just an adaptation of something out there that lets me list out all of the jobs and does a little bit of munging to replace some stuff. I didn't bother going in to figure out, oh, how can I completely change this to do through Power Query? Rather, I said, this query is good for getting me the details. I want to navigate it in a different way. So that, by default, gives me things like the ID and the name and who owns that job. And all of these pieces of data help me answer different questions. So for example, I have used modeling this data to drill into the, well, who owns these jobs? And why might that matter? Well, if someone is leaving the team, you need to know, oops, are there any leftover jobs that are associated with their account only that need to change ownership? Now, you could write a straight up query for that, or you could use this as a, well, yeah, they own that job, but when I pair it with the job history, oh, it's not running anymore. Okay, I'm a little less concerned. Or, oops, their name is associated with a really critical job. So there's merit to, instead of asking very narrow questions, getting enough detail that you can ask questions different ways. And through the magic of the Power BI and Power Query UI, I'm able to do things to fix column names. I'm also able to start fixing the way that some of the data comes in. So for example, when I get that schedule name attribute, it either has a name or it's null. And if I'm thinking about how do I make this easy to navigate, easy to filter, I can do stuff like, right click on the null and give it a more friendly value. That's a classic thing to do for a data warehouse. That's also really useful to do with your admin data. So I have, handy replace values. I'm not going to actually insert it. And I can replace it with a more human readable, not scheduled. And do that same kind of thing for the enabled and alert enabled as well. Because again, if I'm trying to make some data that's easy to interact with and easy for me to look at 3 o'clock in the morning, I don't want to do any more mental math than I need to. I don't want to do any more mental work than I need to. So just going through and cleaning up the job stuff. Same with the job history data. So there's merit to having these in 2 separate pieces because that allows me to ask questions like, well, sure, there might be 17 jobs configured on this, but oh, look at that. Some of these haven't run, or they run so infrequently. That tells me something about, oh, is this like an ad hoc fix-it job? What's going on? So taking in that job history data separately lets me not just answer questions about the relationship between the two, but also be able to ask, well, okay, who doesn't exist on one side or the other? Job history data that's coming in is important to understand too, and this too comes from, pick your favorite reference query from Google or whatever, of getting all of that. And here's another case too where I didn't bother trying to figure out, oh, how can I fix the fact that the runtime comes in a really funky format a different way? I already have the reference query, but I do a little cleaning up in another step here. So great, we've got the data. We also realize, oh, interesting, we're getting 1 row per step. Well, luckily, later we'll look at a calculated measure that helps us figure out how often did this job actually run in a filtered way. Because if we want to represent, okay, how long did the load ETL run? You wouldn't say, well, it's 7 steps, so I better divide it by 7 or something. Better yet to say, okay, we know that when the job completes, we have a way to say, let's just count that as the execution. Okay, so most of you are familiar with the fact that anytime you come into Power BI, you gotta fix some data types. And sometimes it's because the way it comes in is in a way that Power Query can't necessarily recognize as, oh, that's a time. So I went in and used our friend in the data types to fix that. I also realized that, oh, this run duration column, that comes in a kind of funny version of duration. And I understand why they do it that way, because you might have a job that runs for days. But in my case, I happen to know by doing a little data exploring, which you can do easily by taking a look at the sample of the first 1,000, or just generally knowing a little bit about the jobs, that, hey, we can lop off this front couple characters by virtue of some transformations through doing a text after delimiter, which you either can do if you're good at M, or you can do a little bit of fixing through transforming, or excuse me, the extract step. There's just so many wonderful ways to change things. So you can choose to say, okay, well, if I know I have a leading 00 column or 00 colon, I can clean that off. Now, this list of ways that you can transform, does that exist in other languages? Absolutely. Could you write that in a SQL query? Sure. Is it easy? Not necessarily. So I really appreciate the fact that I can easily do data cleanup through the Power Query editor, because sometimes the system's data, it just needs a little cleaning. And once I do that cleaning, I can get it into a duration type, and that duration data type is wonderful, because once it's in the, let me get me on the right context here, once it's in that duration type, I can then do duration type transforms to level this into a unit I can count later. So I can do stuff like say, hey, take that and turn that into, instead of a minute 23, turn that into the total seconds, so that when I look at average runtime, I can always say, all right, I know my units are consistent at seconds. I could also achieve something like this if I have both a start and end time column and do a little subtraction. But in this case, I knew, all right, I already have a field here. It's nearly what I need. Let's use Power Query to clean that up so that I know I can start asking those questions. And then do a little bit more along the lines of, well, what if I want to chunk into a chart saying, when are things running? And I want to chunk it into hours of the day, because it's easier to talk to people about looking at things that are running around 7 o'clock than saying, well, this job runs at 7:44 and 26 seconds. That's when it starts, versus this one starts at 6:28 and 34 seconds. You can do that here. You can also do that back in the data model as well through grouping, and we'll look at that if we have some time as well. So a little bit more transformations, but that's the basic things with the job history. So let's close out of here. Shouldn't have changed anything, and start talking about the way, oh, no, don't you do that. We're not ready to refresh yet. All right, so let's look at this server a bit and talk about the way I'm navigating the history and the jobs. I did set up a relationship between the data. And let's fix some of this, zooming a bit. So anyone who's been working with Power BI for a little while knows that you can set up relationships within the data. But if Power BI hasn't been able to figure out there's a relationship here, you can certainly add your own. Maybe some of you have kind of relied on the auto detecting, but setting up this relationship is what allows me to create filters based on single job names, lets me know the relationship between the two so that I can pair the two in the same visualization, etc. So it's the same kind of relationships you might be setting up between a primary key and a foreign key. Recently, we have jumped to being able to do many-to-many, but if you choose many-to-many, it's going to caution you, holy moly, you better know what you're doing, because it starts getting a lot easier to make mistakes with your measures. So, you know, when the tool says proceed with caution, it's not kidding. All right, so that relationship is what makes it possible to have a table of what are the jobs that run the most with measures and values from both sections. So this job executions measure that I was talking about is able to do a calculated filtered count of just count the rows where step ID is equal to 0. So filter that table up and do a quick count so that I can understand what's the job on this box that runs the most often. And I can take advantage of some cross-filtering. So, okay, if it runs 363 times, yeah, it represents quite a majority of when this job is running. And whereas if I take a look at one of these less frequent, maybe we need a different visualization to look at some of these less frequent when we have such a spread. But the importance is having that cross-filtering and using stuff like the legend to say, well, great, that's interesting. So here's just the list of the failed jobs. And it was really easy to just click on failed and see, okay, so those are the failed ones. And I can see a little bit of a, well, there really isn't a pattern per se. They just keep on happening. It wasn't isolated all to one day. And there's enough of them that what I probably want to do next is say, rather than try to answer all the questions about all the jobs on one pane, let's start with another tab so we can talk a little bit about let's drill into those jobs that aren't working well and talk about them in a way that kind of makes sense, that would be reusable across different servers. So rather than counting the number of failed executions and trying to remember, okay, if it failed 36 times and it usually runs how many, and doing any mental math at all, we're going to use a couple of measures here and work with our detailed data to say, okay, first, I want to take advantage of the fact that I already know how to count how many times this job executed. And then say, great, take that measure and run that same kind of formula, but instead against this table filtered down to the failed. And the reason I want that intermediate measure, you could do this all in one, I'm just trying to make it easier for me to navigate, is then I can create a failure rate. And a failure rate is a much better way to talk about how successful is this job than trying to remember the proportion of the whole or having to look at it side by side. It's just an easy way to level set the, oh boy, this job fails almost all the time versus, well, this job did fail, but boy, not that often. So, okay, if I click then on that job, the reason I want a chart over here is that, well, that'll help me understand, hey, if it's failing 96% of the time, is that every day or is there any date-based pattern? Now, there is a little bit of a foible here with the out-of-the-box line chart visualization. And since it will take too much time, I'll just call it out rather than ask the class. But I understand why they do it. By default, they want to make it really obvious when there are differences in the data. The problem is what your eye does is says, ooh, okay, lowest point, that must be near 0, right? Nope. So rather than let my eye get misled, especially if I'm trying to analyze something when it's been a very long day, I go in and say, hey, y-axis, I know you're trying to help me see differences, but I need you, I'm scrolling too fast. There we go. I need you to automatically start at 0, no matter what, so that I can see differences, sure, but not misinterpret the scale of the difference. So always starting at 0 means I can see the difference that, okay, it had a little bit of a dip on the 11th. It was at least having some success, but not much. And then start looking, and when I see this chart, I know that the differences I'm seeing will also be level across each job. That's a really important thing to think about when you're filtering, is make sure that your proportions are going to be consistent so you don't start maligning something as, gosh, that fails all the time, because the scale keeps changing. Whereas this, we know, oh, okay, well, it had some success until it started, wow, failing all the time. Okay, I better look into that one and figure out, gee, what changed that all of a sudden it had a good day and then went right back to, oh golly, that thing never works. Okay, so that helps. And another wonderful part of Power BI is that there are custom visualizations, and you can get those from the custom visualizations marketplace. And some of them can be really cool in terms of just different ways to navigate your information. So if you're trying to understand on average, hey, how good are the jobs going in kind of a calendar view? And I like this visual from the way it lays things out, because this is, you know, people are pretty comfortable with timelines, and it's a nice way to combine quantity with timeline. But there's a challenge, and this is a challenge that's endemic to custom visuals in particular, in that they don't contain all the formatting that you may be used to in the customs. And while it chose wisely a high contrast color scheme, unfortunately, it's overloaded with, well, if I just looked at this and didn't look at the legend, I'd think, holy moly, this is failing all the time. Nope, it picked the highest, which was succeeded, but made it red. So be aware that you may or may not be able to change data colors and make sure that the custom visuals you use really represent your information, because you're trying to set up ways to interact with this data that will be able to give you answers quickly. And you do not want to accidentally represent something as, if you screen cap that and put it in an email to a boss, the boss would say, phew, why is nobody taking care of this SQL Server? What's going on here? All right, so that's custom visuals. Next up, let's talk a little bit about extended events. So now that this is what I end up doing over and over, is getting 2 sessions going because I'm impatient. Let me connect to my local demo machine here. And extended events as system information are marvelous in that, oh good, SQL Server is just gonna keep collecting stuff and make it available to me without me having to do as much with understanding how you do certain traces. Now, there's a lot of power in extended events and understanding how to explore them, but many people end up a bit intimidated by the data that comes back, because often it comes back in a format that they just have a hard time getting their head around. So, for example, you can set up filtering, and I don't think I have any deadlock activity to show. No, that's one thing that's kind of hard to model, but it's worth thinking about. The deadlock reports that can come back from this can be really helpful in an aggregate if you know how to parse the XML data. Otherwise, you're trying to look at one at a time, figuring out, is it always this same database, or is it always the same stored procedure? So if you've never explored extended events in SQL Server, you will know, or you should know, that every SQL Server has a system health trace running, and you don't get to control the time frame. It rolls based on size, but it can have some really helpful information. I've got this filtered down to just the diagnostics, and you may say, well, great, I just want to see a little bit more information. Oh, shoot, look at that, it's in an XML field. Well, that's not easy to query. And can you write XML queries against extended events? Absolutely, but it's a little bit of a secret handshake society, because if you don't know what's there, you don't know how to create those queries. So let's let Power BI help us a little bit. So let's take a look at that query. I think we're just at about the half-hour point. Yeah, okay. So one thing you may or may not know about extended events is that you can export them. Be mindful of the size, be mindful of your filtering, et cetera, but you can export them. And the reason to export them is to make them easier to explore. So if eventually you want to create your own more isolated extended events trace and start looking at it, it's good for looking at diagnostics over time. I wouldn't say that it can replace an on-fire paging system monitor, but rather to understand hey, what's going on here? What's going on here with query activity over time? If I'm trying to figure out, for example, so who are my Tableau users? Because Tableau isn't giving me an easy way into seeing who's using what, or there's some other reporting tools that have that foible. But you can export to a CSV file. Good old CSVs, man. They're still the place to be able to make data approachable. And that CSV does give you, holy moly, a whole bunch of columns, which might make your brain start to melt, and you would not be wrong to worry about it. But, and this is something I just discovered in the menu system, if I click on this upper left-hand corner, I can go to something like choose columns and say, whoa, not only can I see how many columns are here, but I could say, okay, for this query, I'm going to do a smaller subset. So what I next did after doing a little bit of, okay, let's narrow the field, is get down to, now I have just my dates and what kind of component it was and the big, bad, scary wolf XML column. But it's not so scary when you can say, hey, Power Query, you know what this is? You know what I'd like you to do? It's XML. Can you turn this into something that's easier for me to understand? I'd appreciate it. Now, this is true for extended events. This is true for JSON data. What you should be always mindful of doing as a next step is to do a removed errors, because otherwise you're going to end up with some of these values for whatever reason that will have one bad thing in them and they won't convert and your entire query won't refresh. So this is a sampling exercise. This is not a data conversion exercise. So it's a-okay to go in and say, hey, we need to remove some rows from here. We're going to remove the error rows. So that's always my next step. After I tell something that's JSON, that's XML, the next step is always go ahead and remove things that won't convert. Just make that part of your plan. And then I can expand that XML data, and which you expand through that little expandy guy thing here. And that will tell you, wow, there's a lot in that XML. And I can make it look at all of the columns, and I can do even things like search in the columns for, what do we got in here about CPU stuff? Oh, cool. And in this case, what I chose to do was say, let's calm down in terms of what values I want. And I was able to do some more filtering because I wanted to say, let's get down to looking at metrics that I want to pay attention to, like system CPU utilization versus SQL utilization, and get down to just the traces based on the system component. Because if we look at the expanded data, the fact that the XML in each of those traces is different is what gives us that null pattern for, well, some of these rows will include this information and some include that. Filtering down to the system component, where's my system? Yeah, down to the system component meant that I could level set on the XML attributes that would come in consistently. So be mindful of that. Sometimes you'll expand XML and you'll think, oh shoot, some of these have different schemas than others. Okay, figure out how to filter down so that you can get reliable data in each column. And then I did a little bit of breaking up of the date time field, because I love the fact that I can make things easier to chart and interact with by saying, hey, let's add a column that's date only, and let's add a column that's time only, because that might make things easier for me to do some charting on. Okay, I'm not going to refresh this just yet. I am going to go back to the tab. So I was able to, by exploring this extended events data, start comparing SQL CPU versus Max system CPU. And you know, this is a kicker with when you look at CPU and other measures in other ways. Well, a max on a particular day, is that meaningful or not? I don't know, but hey, we've got an interesting kind of disparity in Max versus Max SQL versus Max System on June 10th. So let's employ a little of our cross filtering to do two things. Let me enable drill through and then expand this out so I can see, oh, okay, the reason the system CPU was pegging was that's probably when I'm waking up that particular VM. It's not a case of, oh no, that's pegging the whole system CPU when the ETL is running. It's rather saying, well, for waking up, it had a lot of stuff to do. Okay, cool. So let's go back up a level and say, rather than the 10th, let's look at a different day and see what its pattern was like. So another case of a wide margin. Let me go back up a level here, and let's look at the 6th when, they both pegged kind of high. That's interesting. So tell me a little bit about what that day looked like, please. Okay, so for this time, apparently when it was waking up or something, I'd need to know more about that box and drill into it. Both of them pegged, and it took a little bit longer for those pieces to calm down, if you will. Now, this visual needs some help. It depends on the data it works with. I am debating about how this axis should work, but what you can see by my hovering is that I've got some grouping going on here. And this is another one of those, gosh, this is kind of hard to do in other places and certainly in queries. But if I have something that's easily categorized numerically, time-wise, etc., I can create groups. And the reason I like to do that with spans of time is that I can start saying, I want to create 15-minute blocks, or I want to make 30-minute blocks, so that I can watch behavior over time in ways that's a little bit smoothed out, and then do maxes and averages, etc., within that time frame. So that's a really useful thing to keep in your tool belt. And that's also worth doing for if you wanted to say, we'll stay with the CPU example. What if you wanted to say, I want to know when it's, let's filter it into when it's in a range of 70 to 90 versus 60 to 70. You can start making some of your own group sizing and categorize the data in a way, or if it's happened 1 to 7 times or something like that. Actually, no, I'm sorry, you'd need to do it. I think the thing to be mindful with grouping is that you've got to do it off a column. I don't think you can do it off of measures. That's something I'd need to Google. But it's really helpful to create categories without having to necessarily be as facile with DAX or something like that. Okay. So there's just getting through some basic SQL Server level stuff. There's other reasons, especially as a BI professional, to know about IT level data that's available to you, because sometimes you're coming in to a situation where maybe you have to inherit a particular reporting tool, like reporting services, and you're trying to move them forward into, okay, what can I learn from this to create a better model of your business data? So I need to know, who are my subject matter experts? What's most commonly used here? How are they performing? And are they using, in this case, reporting services as mostly an export agent? Really common fate for reporting services instances. So if I want to understand, it's important to be able to meet with people who are actually using this, and you can't always trust anecdotal information to do that. So if you've been a reporting services administrator for X amount of time, you may have encountered the wonder that is the execution log 3 view. And I got a good question on this yesterday. So reporting services by default out of the box will keep 60 days worth of execution history in its report server database, but you can tweak that. And I do recommend tweaking that to at least 91, 93 days or more, because often when you're trying to analyze what's being used over time, you need to capture at least a quarter's worth of activity. You could even go as far out as half a year's worth, but don't don't start becoming a data pack rat, because knowing what report was most popular a year and a half ago doesn't mean anything anymore. It's really important to understand the context of the time behavior that you're interacting with for IT data, because you can't, it's just like, you don't care 2 years ago when your box was pegging. Your business has changed, your environment has changed, but having the context of a quarter's worth of activity helps you say, I know that that report gets used a lot as part of quarter close, so that I wouldn't say, oh, don't bother migrating that. Nobody's used it in the last 2 weeks. That's not wide enough. So interacting with this data and changing some of those settings can help you get better information. So we'll take a quick look at the query here. And I won't belabor too much of the transforming, but the execution log 3 view does have XML data within it as well. And what's important to know here, let me get out of this view, is that you can get a lot of metrics that can help you understand not only what report is the most popular, and you might want to do some top filtering on this, because in a normal reporting services instance, it's probably more than 4. But start understanding the behavior, because we can track the format of, oh, okay, so who's using, I inherited a box once that was basically a PDF generator for an application. That's fine, but it was just good to know that it wasn't a live report environment at all. It was all about an application calling it, because I get data like username, all that fun stuff. And then I can look at things like, well, if I'm trying to figure out when to take this down for patching, or if I'm trying to understand, do we really need to do a migration over a weekend or after hours at 10 p.m. as it turns out nobody's using it until, you know, even 6 p.m., etc., or do some days of the week type stuff as well. And right now I don't have the sorting fixed on this, because by default this chart wants to do most to least. But since I did set up my sorting, I can say sorted by day name and sort ascending. That's another thing to be mindful of with your time data, and then you can fix the column width here too. And you can start looking at performance stuff, and this drills a little bit into that concept of average versus median. Very important if you're starting to aggregate your measures of performance, because you need to know where are my outliers. So I wouldn't malign this animal facts report as, oh my gosh, on average it takes 30 seconds. Nobody's going to wait for that. Well, there's an outlier or two that's influencing that, because the median is it's sub-second, no big deal. So important context to have. And I included a little tab on this one of other ways that you might want to navigate with this, because you even get parameter use in here, and that can help you understand how people are exploring the data. Okay, so we better get finished up here.
Yep.
All right. Yep, and luckily I only have like 2 more things to say, and then we can do questions. Okay, so be mindful. And you guys, especially people who use Power BI, know this, because just because it's a chart doesn't mean it will be interpreted correctly unless you're careful about how it's put together. So I have 2 examples here. One that was literally cited as one of the bad charts of 2017. And you know, there are so many problems with this. 1, it's in equal pieces, even though what it's representing is not equal. 2, the percentages don't add up to 100%. Most of the Power BI visuals should keep you away from this, but be careful how you do the filtering and how you explore the scale of the data, so you don't end up with thinking something is dramatically different from another when really there is some outlier influencing it. And I liked this, this anti-example of all of the ways that you can fool people with data, if you will. So that might be a fun thing for folks to look at. It was on Twitter recently. And then as you're creating these visuals, and I believe Megan Longoria was on today, and she has great advice on how to make visuals more accessible, more usable. But as you're pulling in IT data, be careful of the volume of what you have access to. So Power BI will try its level best to do things like, sure, I'll profile that table that has 1 million rows. Come back when I'm done. Whoops, no, be careful. Just like anything, be mindful of how your query is being written and be mindful of the data you're pulling down, because mostly I like to interact with an import mode because I'm trying not to pester the server as I change my mind. But I also got to be careful about the data I pull in, so that if I'm trying to look at data profiling for patient data, maybe I don't need to pull that patient name down because I don't want to have copies of it locally, something like that. For sharing from Power BI Desktop, the free option is for you to export the PDF or do screen caps. Anything more than that means either sending the PBIX file around or starting with your licensing. But it's still viable. It certainly can be used. It's just not, it's free, so it's a little more work. And then finally, when you're creating these reports to interact with system performance, less is more. Found this as a generic screen cap example of a dashboard online, and it's whiz bang all right. But if I'm trying to create a visual that helps me at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm paged about the ETL failing at some step, and I'm trying to understand maybe what's left or whatever, that's a lot to look at. So there's a reason that Canvas is as small as it is. It's okay. You're not paying by the tab. You can add other views. You can answer the questions on different pages. It's okay. And at the end here, I've got 3 slides of links of resources of official stuff from Microsoft, including if you love to learn from example like I do, you can pull stuff right off their GitHub. It's amazing. They've got some outstanding user groups and bloggers from their team. Obviously, Power BI Days is an excellent resource, including the fact that these recordings are available. One of the resources I discovered recently, Ruth Posello Martinez, I hope I'm saying that right. She is an outstanding teacher, especially for DAX. And as you start interacting with system data and want to figure out different ways to measure it, wow, I really enjoy her teaching style. I find her very helpful, and she's prolific, and she has some more advanced paid stuff too. Power BI Tips is great. I need to spend some time there getting some theming information and other stuff. And then Megan, on one of our presenters, I really like her Power BI usability checklist. And then some other bloggers as well that I can call out. A lot of you probably are familiar with them, but if you're not, check them out as well. Okay, we've got a smidge of time, I think, for questions.
Okay, cool. At the last minute, some questions at least one question came in.
Okay.
Thor said, it's a long message. Yeah, the tip. Yeah, so there was a report page where the line graph had a lot of date time values in the x-axis.
Yes, it was a mess. Yep, he's right.
Yeah. He says, you said that it was not optimal, and he thinks this can be fixed by looking at the x-axis setting.
Yeah, continuous versus categorical, I imagine. Is that where he's going? Yeah, and that works sometimes. I've found places where it won't allow me to make that change, and I haven't figured out the foible, but I agree. There are times where that continuous access can really dampen the noise. But I agree. Good point.
Yeah, that's basically it. Nobody else.
Okay. Well, here's my contact info if anyone has other questions. Otherwise, I appreciate those who tuned in, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody today. But if not, enjoy the rest of your day of learning.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. They all stayed attentive throughout the entire webinar.
Good.
Yeah. So next up in 10 minutes is Megan Longoria with 5 easy enhancements to increase accessibility in your Power BI reports.
Outstanding. Yes, definitely hang around for her. She knows her stuff.
Indeed. Same with you, by the way.
Well, thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.